Hi, welcome back to the channel, Michelle, and today I'm going to be talking about and reviewing the new Julie Bogart book, Raising Critical Thinkers. Now, this has probably become my favorite homeschooling book. Now, Julie Bogart, of course, has written The Brave Learner, she has The Brave Writer, all that stuff. I really enjoyed The Brave Learner. I haven't done any of the Brave Writer curriculum or anything like that, but I saw her talking about this in a little snippet of something, and I was like, ooh, I really want to check that book out. So I got it from my local library, and I think it's an awesome resource. I think she touches on a topic that is often overlooked or missed in both public school, private school, and homeschooling education, which is the ability to raise critical thinkers. So I'm going to go over a couple of the key things I really enjoyed about the book. So first I'll give you, here's a quick look of the table of contents. So the first thing that I really like about this book is she talks about the interpretation of facts and how the way a fact can be presented can influence how you interpret that fact. So for example, I'm going to read the example right here. So here are two facts. Dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945 was an unjustified act of war by the United States. Second one, dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945 was a necessary act of war by the United States. So you can see both those statements contain facts, but depending on how they are written and given to the reader influences how you interpret those facts. And she goes into how that can interpret what you're reading and how to apply critical thinking skills into that. She goes over prejudice, bias, and opinion and how that affects what we're learning. She talks about how it's important to be curious without being defensive when you come to learning or reading new materials. So she says, education, however, depends on the ability to be dispassionately curious. Shouldn't we be passionate about our opinions and beliefs? Yes, for ourselves. But we also have a responsibility to teach our children and ourselves to be curious without defensiveness. The good news is that academic work can be a safe place to explore and think. The academic disposition protects the student if the student adopts it. The task of a learner is not to render verdicts every time the student runs into a new perspective. In other words, reading viewpoints the learner doesn't hold is not a challenge to anyone's integrity. Reading is not voting. The only task is to pass the eyes along the page. So she's talking about how you need to be able to approach material without being defensive, without automatically shutting down because it is not exactly what you think or believe. And I think that's really important. She goes over the difference between memorization and talks about working memory versus long-term memory and why it's important to understand the difference between those, but also when you're using materials and educational materials, that blatant memorization is going to get you nowhere. It's not going to teach you to critically think. You need to be able to look at the text, the problem, whatever it is, and be able to dissect it and come from different perspectives, not just one perspective. She talks about the importance of asking questions. So the art of questioning becomes the key to thinking in the classroom. Educators should be questioning not to guide student thinking in line with theirs, but to provoke thinking and to discover what students know and understand. Critical thinking grows in an emotionally stable, supportive environment where real problems are explored by the teacher and student together. I think the key point of that is the point of education is not to make our children believe exactly what we believe, but to give them the environment, understanding, room to grow into their own understanding. So I think that is really a key point to teaching our children. So reading throughout this entire book, I felt like I was seen so many times because so much of what I've encountered, especially in the homeschooling world, has been very closed-minded or bubbled or don't want to offer multiple perspectives on certain things. And a lot of the curriculum I've come across is just really biased and a lot of perspective and a lot of opinion. And like I did with that first example, yes, some of them are stating facts, but they're intertwining their own perspectives with that. And that's personally not how I want to teach my children. So she also goes into video games in here, which I think is probably an issue that a lot of parents have about video games and regulating what their kids can do. And I was it was interesting because I'm actually dealing with this issue within our house too. My 10-year-old got Animal Crossing for her birthday, and she's become obsessed with the game. She wants to do it all the time. First thing she wants to do in the morning is play her game. And I was grappling with this, well, do I set limitations on it? Do I need to oversee what she's doing and things like that? And I talked to my husband, and of course there's, child safety within the game and things like that. But he was talking about how it is really positive that she's able to explore this. So Animal Crossing is you have this island and you build up, houses, and you can go to other islands and explore different things. And it's made for children. And he was talking about how it really lets her explore her creativity, her identity, and those are all positive things. Time management, all these things. I mean, she has a job on the island that she's responsible for different things. And I think that's an excellent point, and Julie Bogart talks about this, that video games aren't the enemy. They're not going to turn your children into horrible people, that they allow them to explore worlds, feelings outside of themselves in a safe environment. I think that's actually a really good point, and it's funny that just happened to be at the same point that we were personally dealing with, video games and things like that. She talks about credibility and how it's important to look at who's writing it and the facts being talked about before reading the entirety of an article or book, because if you get sucked into that confirmation bias or seeking the information you already believe to be true, you're not going to want to then find out that, oh, by the way, this person isn't a credible source. You're going to overlook that because it aligns with your own personal thoughts, opinions, perspective, whatever it may be, that you really need to be checking out the resources or the credibility of the person before you start reading into it. And that's one of the things I actually do with my homeschooling curriculum, which I'll link up above, how I kind of evaluate that. But that's one of the main first steps I do is when I'm looking at a curriculum, I look at who writes it, their educational background, the resources they pull, because that is really important as an educator to make sure you're using quality, well-researched, factual information in your education. She talks about how higher education is important because it takes you past book learning. So this isn't just college, this is trade, anything like that, that it's the first time in your life you're often put into practice what you learned. So I thought that was really interesting because, again, I have a video about the importance and the value of education, and I kind of talk about that, where my college experience was the first time I was able to critically think and ask, what do I think actually? My public school education was very route memorization and things like that. She goes into the interpretation of difficult or hard topics and why things like cultural appropriation and taking into account other perspectives is really important. She talks about living history and how sometimes that can be really offensive to different cultures. So she talks about how one teacher in a public school setting wanted her students to experience the Middle Passage. So she had them lay under their desks and put storm music on and flicker at the lights. And why is that wrong? That is, first of all, that doesn't compare to what slaves had to encounter at all. Two, can you imagine being a descendant from someone within that group and living through that experience? Like, how traumatic would that be? Not to mention you're just diminishing the traumatic impact that had on that group of people. Same thing with, she talked about how one classroom designed a teepee and made headdresses and made like a peace pipe and told stories around a fire. Why is that disrespectful? Well, because headdresses, peace pipes, those things are very important to the Native American community. They have cultural significance to them. So to dress up and pretend to be them is not appropriate. And I see this in a lot of history curriculums and homeschooling where it's like playing the part, and there's a line. There's a line where when you're only taking in one perspective and it's not learning about, it's not appreciating. There's a difference between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. I will actually link down an article that kind of talks about the difference between those, because that's something I'm very mindful in my homeschooling, but I do see a lot of that in especially history curriculums where it's not taking into account the perspective of everyone involved. So I really appreciate that she talked about that. All right, she talks about why it's important to have different perspectives and meet new people, that you don't want to just bubble yourself into this little group of people where everybody thinks the same and does everything the same. So I'm going to read a quote from the book as well. One of the key ways to increase your children's global understanding is to resist the temptation to shelter your children away from people who think differently than your family and community. Rather, by establishing relationships with others, we reduce the tendency to perpetuate stereotypes. We also gain new skills for living. For instance, learning how to make someone's cuisine, discovering a belief that brings you comfort, etc., etc. So it's important to not only learn about different perspectives, but really engage in other people's way of life. Because it's one thing to read about it, but again, it's a whole other thing to be a part of it and see how that works. And she goes into, how it can be not comfortable, and how you need to learn to accept that discomfort in the situation. That, again, not approaching something from a defensive stance that this person does this or this person believes this and I don't, that you can still both hold your own personal perspectives, beliefs, and respect each other, and that's completely possible. One of the things she really talks about is, having an open mind, and how that's not always easy, because we can tell our children, have an open mind when entering something. But no matter what our situation is, we will always bring our own bias, our own perspective, our own life experience to something. So are we truly ever going to be open-minded to hearing other people's truth, beliefs, perspective? So, for example, one of the really difficult parts about listening to other people's beliefs, perspectives, opinions, whatever, that are different from yours is it makes you feel like you have to defend yourself or you're wrong. And I'm going to read a quote again from the book. If you've made behavior commitments to match your truth, you'll be more resistant to contradictory evidence. The escalation of commitment bias, interferes with your ability to accept challenges to your beliefs. No, having an open mind will solve it for you. In fact, you'll see having an open mind as dangerous. Communities double down on their vision of the truth all the time. Whether an official group like members of religious faith or people who share the same ideological posture, the faithful will see any challenges as hearsay, not new evidence to consider. So what does that mean? It means that sometimes you're taught not to believe a certain way or not to accept a certain belief because it's seen as wrong and not acceptable. And that is, I think, one of the critical things we're missing, is that it's okay to accept others. It's okay. And I can understand why, especially some homeschoolers are like, no, this book is horrible, because it's promoting acceptance and really trying to understand one another. And that is scary for a lot of people, because if you're raised in an environment or a culture where certain things are not allowed, that's going against what you're thinking. And we can't teach anything that we don't personally believe. No, the point of education is to teach, our children, and I talk about this in another video, our children don't need to be taught what we think, what we believe, our political views. They live with us. They know those things. They know exactly where we stand on things. What they need as part of their education is exposure to different ideas, perspectives, thoughts, opinions, because that is education, giving them the outside world. So when they grow up, their bubble isn't popped and they realize, oh my God, there's an entire world out there. Because yes, there is an entire world out there full of diverse people with different cultures, perspectives, backgrounds, and thinking you are better than those people is wrong. So I really appreciate that she talked about that and the importance of, open mind, but it's not always easy. She talks about it's not easy to put yourself in other people's shoes, because again, we come from those already biased points of view because of our own life experiences. And there was a quote that I really liked in here about the importance of, if you want to understand someone else, go to the source. Listen to the leaders and members of the community, not your own community's interpretation of the other side. I think that's really important. Again, going to the source instead of saying, well, we don't like this group of people because of this. Well, go meet someone in that group. Go meet one of their leaders. Go meet someone that represents that actual group and see them as a human being. It might change your perspective. She talks about context. So one thing I thought was really interesting is the passive voice often written in text. And this is often seen in homeschooling curriculum, where the way it's presented already gives you a concrete point of view. So for example, she was talking about in a paragraph about violence against women, how it's often portrayed that this many women were assaulted, or this many women became impregnated, blah, 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 as a statistic. But what it's not saying is, well, this many men assaulted females, or this many men impregnated women. The passive voice here puts the emphasis on the victims rather than the perpetrators. And this is the type of lens to know when we're interpreting any text. And I think that's really important, because the old proverb that you'll always hear the winner's perspective, or a certain perspective, especially when we talk about history, we're getting a very certain perspective when it comes to that. And that's not the only perspective, that we need to come from multiple sources when we're teaching our children. I think that's really, really important. So one of the things she talks about is classic literature, and I think that's a big one in here, because there's an entire homeschool styles based on using classical literature, and how that can have some damaging effects. So she goes into the Little House series about how, kids were just read this without any contextual knowledge, and it led to some racist beliefs. Now, does it portray early pioneers, their experiences? Yes, but if you don't bring in the lens of this is not how it should be, we should not be treating individuals like this, if you're not having those deeper conversations, then you are embedding those beliefs into your child without even knowledge. So I know that book series is really popular. Personally, my kids, we tried one of them, never really liked it. But I think it's important. You can still use classical literature, but you need to be talking about the underlying tones in those classical literature books that were written from a certain perspective that can help you understand a certain perspective, but to also talk about how not every perspective is represented in that book. So the last thing she talks about is one of the most important things we can do as parents, educators, is to allow for the change of mind. And that's not always easy. So our children will look to us to see if it's okay to change their minds, that they don't have to double down on whatever they believe and refuse to understand or listen to another person because they don't exactly agree with them. That it's okay that when presented with new information or facts or perspectives, it's okay to change your mind. And I think that's one of the essential things we should be teaching our children, not just in education, but in life in general. It's okay that you change your mind. So I highly, highly recommend this book. I think it was an awesome read. It is definitely one of the best homeschooling resources books I have found, and one of the things I really like about each chapter is she goes through and gives you exercises to do. So she's not just telling you, this is how you should critically think, but it goes through and gives you different exercises, and it gives you based on age. So bright-eyed 5 to 9, quick-witted 10 to 12, nimble-minded 13 to 18. So for example, the first one was reading a fable or a fairy tale and talking about whose perspective the story is coming from. How can we believe that person's perspective? And it goes through that in every chapter. There's an activity, sometimes multiple activities, how to pick apart information, how to find reliable resources. So really helpful information, getting you to think about what you're reading, the lens and perspective you're coming at it, and also giving you tools to access those critical thinking skills. Because I think as adults, a lot of us never were taught, really, especially in home life or in our education, to think critically, and it's very important. So like I said, I highly recommend this book. If you have any specific questions, leave them down below. Now, thank you for watching.